Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us for our Being Human Humanities Speaker Series, presented in partnership with Jefferson Community and Technical College. Today, we are joined by Brenda Edgar and Rick Hanson for today's talks on the theme of death. In this series, we've been exploring the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And so we finish up tonight, December 17th, on the theme of death. Tonight's program will conclude our Being Human series. We have really enjoyed it. And we have a new series to look forward to, brought to us by Brenda Edgar, who is co-chair of the Fine Art Department at Jefferson Community and Technical College. This new series is called Art and Beyond, and it will be on the same schedule as Being Human. It will be the 3rd Thursday of the month, starting in January at 6:30 p.m. So that will be Thursday, January 21st at 6:30 p.m. So keep your eyes peeled on the library's Facebook page and website for more information to come about Art and Beyond with Brenda Edgar. So with that, I will introduce Brenda Edgar, who will be our first speaker this evening. So thank you so much for being here, Brenda.
Thank you very much. Sharing my screen. And I'm just going to ask you guys if you can see that.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Cool. Well, thanks for the introduction, Laura. I'm really looking forward to sharing this with you guys tonight. Since the theme is death, I decided to focus on dead bodies of holy people in the Middle Ages. So the title of my talk is Miraculous Bones, the Cult of Relics in the Middle Ages. Even though the talk is titled Miraculous Bones, these photographs on this slide actually show blood relics instead of bones. So we'll get to the bones soon enough. But I thought it would be cool to start out with these contemporary photographs that show us that the cult of relics is not an extinct tradition. It had its heyday in the Middle Ages, but it is still very much woven into the fabric of Catholic cultures all over the globe. So on the left, we have the blood reliquary of San Gennaro being carried through the streets of Naples, Italy on September 19th, which is his feast day. The blood of San Gennaro is inside one of those reliquaries that they're carrying there. And I'm going to show you a close-up of it in a minute. But that vial of blood is solid for most of the year, but on certain days, including his feast day, it turns to liquid and is paraded through the streets. So that is still very much a living tradition. On the right is another relic of blood. This is the relic of the precious blood, meaning the blood of Christ himself. And it is here being carried through the streets of Bruges, Belgium, where it lives. The reliquary contains a cloth stained with the blood of Christ. So another thing we can pick up on here in these pictures is that portability is key for relics. They have to be able to be paraded about to fulfill the role that they play in civic and religious ritual. On my next slide here, just to make sure that we're all on the same page vocabulary-wise, a relic, in the way we're talking about it, is a literal body part of a saint or other holy person. It could also be something that the holy person just had physical contact with. Relics are believed by the faithful to have supernatural power, healing power, and spiritual power. A reliquary is very simply just a container for So on this slide, we're just going to take a brief overview of the fact that all of the major world religions, except Hinduism, have rich relic traditions. So it's not just a Catholic thing. Top left there is a close-up, as promised, of the blood relic of San Gennaro in its liquefied state. To the right there is a hair of the Prophet Muhammad, which has traveled the world. Bottom left, you could say, is the Uber relic, the prototypical relic, the Ark of the Covenant, which was made at God's command to house the tablets of the law, the rod of Aaron, and a pot of manna. Of course, there's a line drawing of it there because it's been lost since ancient times. And finally, a tooth of the Buddha, which is very interesting in and of itself, but in the interest of time, we'll just leave it at that so we can see that relics translate into more than one culture. So there are three classes of relics in the Catholic tradition. And so I'm going to walk you through those three classes by looking at, on this slide, only relics of St. Peter the Apostle and the Martyr and the first Pope. On the left, that would be an example of a first-class relic inside a reliquary. It is the reliquary of the rib of St. Peter. The reliquary is shaped like a rib. A lot of times the shape of the reliquary has something important to tell us. And in this case, it tells us what it contains. Although the rib piece itself is actually in that rock crystal cylinder in the center, the shape of the relic communicates with us. So since it is an actual body part that's in there, it's a bone, it qualifies as a first-class relic, an actual body part. The second picture shows the top of the staff reliquary of St. Peter. The staff is a second-class relic, also called the contact relic, because it's not a part of Peter's body, but it's something that he touched a lot that's inside there. So supposedly inside there is the wooden staff of St. Peter, and it has been encrusted in a bejeweled golden reliquary. Just a technical note, contact relics of Jesus himself, something like the Shroud of Turin, if genuine, would qualify as first class. So Jesus's relics kind of skip a step on the ladder. And then we have third class relics. If we wanted to go out and purchase a relic of St. Peter today, we could do that with no problem. We could buy a medal that's got his picture on the front and on the back, a third class relic of his, or we could buy a holy card that has St. Peter's picture on the front and a relic on the back. And as the close-up of the holy card on the bottom there tells you, that little white disc is a relic because it has been touched to some relics of St. Peter. So in other words, a third class relic is something that has touched the body of a saint. So it's stages of removal. One of the issues that comes up with studying and understanding relics, especially in the Christian Middle Ages, is, well, anywhere really, is problems of authentication. As an example, currently there are four places in the world that claim to have the head of John the Baptist, and here they all are. So there's one in Amiens, there's one in Damascus, and there's one in Munich, and then there's the official one that's recognized by the church, which is in Rome. So, relics are sort of well, it's a matter of faith, which is something that's beyond science anyway. But, many times relics are, impossible to authenticate. And this just kind of highlights that issue. So what do people do with relics? How do they interact with them? Well, for the most part, they touch them and they kiss them. When you go to see a relic, that is the way that you interface with it. You also say prayers, of course, in its presence. And this combination of things kind of activates the relic and its supernatural powers. As an example, the hand reliquary of St. Teresa of Avila, its shape, again, is telling us something. What's inside of that reliquary is an actual hand that belonged to St. Teresa. Now, this is actually later than the Middle Ages, but it's a really good photo to show us these two nuns interacting with the Holy Hand. The center picture shows you a woman kissing the crown of thorns in Notre Dame de Paris, I'm assuming before 2019. And so we're actually going to take another look at the crown of thorns in a minute, but again with the kissing. And if we wanted to go online, we would be able to buy some relics that we could interact with at home. We could buy a 5-pack of sacred oil that has been brought in contact with the hair of the Virgin Mary. And we could anoint ourselves with that oil and in that way actually come in contact with a relic. Or we could buy a pendant that has a speck of dust from the tomb of St. Francis of Assisi underneath a red crystal there. And we could wear that, close to our heart and sort of, live with and actually wear on our bodies these relics, and the oils and dirt that they leave behind are even holy by contact. I want to share real quick this picture of my grandma's relics. Her name was Jean Bass. I have not really been able to find out much at all about these relics because I can't really find anything else like them. As an art appraiser friend of mine who also has never really seen anything quite like them. But they are third-class relics. Don't know where they came from originally. They're probably from the early 20th century. They're very small, and some are hand decorated. The one on the far right reveals some signs of wear, so it looks like it was probably carried or held a lot. So what's inside these little pouches are, most likely just little pieces of linen that were touched to, a shrine somewhere that had relics in it. So now I'm going to walk you through sort of a quick history of reliquaries in the Middle Ages, starting here in the early Middle Ages. The earliest medieval relics from the Holy Land that have survived are there on the left. This is a reliquary box now in the Vatican, and it contains soil and stones from holy sites there in a specially decorated box. So that would have been a pilgrim souvenir. Somebody who, made the long and dangerous journey to the Holy Land, prayed in the presence of all of these holy places, and wanted to bring a little bit of that home. On the right is another early medieval reliquary. It is called a Bourse reliquary because it's in the shape of a purse. It was designed sort of to mimic a cloth or leather bag that people would use to carry around their collections of relics. So a lot of times reliquaries were not meant to encase a single relic, but more often a collection of relics. So that's what this piece would have been used for. The Carolingian period was a major point of transition for the cult of relics due to Charlemagne, the first Carolingian emperor, who was an avid relic collector, really into it. So under his leadership, relics were mandated as a necessary component of every altar in every church. His personal relic collection included the swaddling blanket of baby Jesus, which is shown wrapped up and hanging below right, and the dress of the Virgin Mary below left, which is surprisingly enormous. And he also had the holy foreskin, which I regret is no longer extant, and so I can't show you a picture of it. Perhaps that's for the best. So the Carolingian centuries saw this increasing tendency to divide and disperse relics. So there was this general shift away from the old primacy of holy places, dirt and stones, and intact, incorrupt bodies in their burial sites. And there was a shift towards the power contained within each single part of the bodies of holy people. The thinking was that why keep, this entire saint's body in one spot when if we break him up and send them all over the world, we just increase, the holy that we're putting out there. So maybe a little, counter to contemporary logic, but that was the thinking. So Charlemagne's story gets more interesting. He was never officially canonized as a saint, but because he was a passionate champion of the church, he was thought of as a saintly figure for sure in the Middle Ages. So he was buried, at his death, of course, but then his remains were exhumed later in the year 1000 under the order of the Emperor Otto III. And they found that his body had not decayed except for the tip of his nose, which was missing. Otto supposedly had it remade, whatever that means. His fingernails were found to have grown through his gloves, so they cut those off and kept them as relics. They removed one of his teeth, kept it as a relic, and then they put the rest of his body in that golden shrine there, the Karl Shrine, which is in Aachen Cathedral, except for the top of his skull, which is in the Karlsbuste, which is the thing that you see there in the bottom right. You can even see his skull in there. So fragmenting bodies makes them more powerful. And, the great irony of this story is that the relic collector ultimately became a relic himself, or a collection of relics. So the Romanesque period, 11th and 12th centuries, this is the golden age of reliquaries. They became very, very popular. These examples on this page are all from the Romanesque period, and they, again, show us that the form of a reliquary, the shape that it takes, always has something to tell us about the meaning and the function and the context of the relic. So left to right, the Becket Casket on the left is in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. It's an example of the very popular Limoges style of Champlevé enamel work. Dozens of Becket caskets survive, but this one is special because it probably held the first-class relics of Thomas of Becket that were owned by the Abbot of Canterbury. A casket or chasse reliquary is shaped like a miniature church. So, with the relics inside that little house-shaped structure, it's sort of like creating a little miniature shrine itself. In the center, we have a reliquary cross. It's in the Cloisters Museum in New York. And it has numerous relics from the Holy Land, including a fragment of the True Cross. They're actually set into it on the exterior of it, visibly, alternating with bits of colored glass that sort of simulate precious stones. And we know which relics are on this piece because they're identified by a long inscription that runs up and down both sides of the reliquary. And on the right, we have a reliquary bust of Saint Bodine. It is a life-sized gilded copper bust. Its raised left hand holds the base of a vial that once contained the saint's blood, and its head, with its movable white and black eyes, may or may not once have contained his skull. Another famous Romanesque reliquary, the Stabilo Triptych, is a 3-paneled Romanesque reliquary and portable altar done in gold and enamel, and it's intended to protect and display pieces of the True Cross. It was created in the 12th century and today is in New York. So the smaller triptychs in the center actually contain the relics of the True Cross. They are slightly earlier and of Byzantine origin. The left panel contains enameled roundels with scenes from the life of Constantine, the first Christian emperor. Then on the right wing are scenes from the legend of the True Cross, in which St. Helen, who is Constantine's mother, tortures intelligence out of a group of Jews in the Holy Land, the bottom scene, by threatening them with fire. In the second scene up, she discovers the true cross. And in the top scene, she proves the authenticity of the cross by using it to heal a very sick man. Pilgrimage was a big part of the reason why relics were so important during the Romanesque period. Pilgrimage is just any long journey undertaken for religious reasons. And pilgrimage also is not just a Catholic thing. It's part of many of the world's religious traditions. But for Christians living in the Romanesque period in Europe, these were the 5 most important pilgrimage destinations. The Holy Land was one, the Shrine of the Three Kings in Cologne, Germany, the Tomb of St. Peter and many other sites in Rome, the Tomb of St. Thomas of Becket in Canterbury. And in the center, the most important of all was Santiago de Compostela, which is a church in Spain. On the map, you can see it circled in purple. And it is where the remains of St. James the Apostle are believed to be. So people would walk on foot, by horseback if they could manage it, through from various points of origin in France, along the pilgrimage roads, through the Pyrenees Mountains, and eventually, hopefully, get to Compostela. This is a church that is on the way to Compostela. So there's a little town circled in yellow on the map. That town is Conques, and the Church of Saint Foy is there. And it was a waypoint. It was a stopover for pilgrims on the way to Compostela. This is what they went to Saint Foy to see. This is the main attraction there. Saint Foy was an early Christian child martyr. The head of her reliquary contains a piece of her skull. The wooden head itself is actually from the 5th century. It was mounted on a wooden core and covered with gold in the 9th century. Reports of miracles increased the reliquary's fame. The gold, so this is a piece that was added onto and added onto so many times over the centuries. And it's very impossible to date because of that. The core of the head itself is actually from the Roman, just after the Roman Empire. The gold crown, earrings, gold throne, filigree work, and cameos and jewels were mostly donations from pilgrims, wealthy pilgrims, of course, in subsequent centuries. In the 14th century, a pair of crystal balls and their mounts were added. And then silver arms and hands in the 16th century. And in the 18th century, bronze shoes and plates on the knees were added. The relic itself had been stolen from the nearby town of Aachen by the monks of Conques in a furtum sacrum, or holy robbery. A lot of relics have amazing legends attached to them. In the Romanesque, we had a whole lot of body part reliquaries that are shaped like body parts. So on this page, heads. So on the left is the head reliquary of Pope Alexander. And unlike what its form suggests, it probably did not just contain somebody's, Alexander's head. It probably originally contained the relics of several saints, again, sort of a collection. And, a lot of times, by the time these things end up in museums, there's nothing in them at all. And that's the case with that one. The head reliquary of St. Eustace on the right in the British Museum, it still does have its contents. So it has relics of several saints and pieces of the skull, presumably of St. Eustace himself. There are also foot reliquaries. So on the left, the portable altar of St. Andrew contains the sandal of the Apostle Andrew, which is why it has the foot shape on it, among other relics, including a nail from the true cross and the beard of St. Peter. So put that in our Peter collection. So that one still does have its stuff in it. The foot reliquary of St. Blaise on the right is empty today, but probably at one time contained relics of multiple saints. Arm reliquaries are much more common than feet. But again, most arm-shaped reliquaries do not contain arms. That being said, the leftmost one on this slide does. It has an arm bone in it, probably of an apostle, but the other ones do not. So arm reliquaries were used as liturgical props, so that they used that hand, the priest would use that hand reliquary as an extension of himself, and he would use it to touch and bless people, quite literally. So in many cases, the arm does not signify the contents of the reliquary, but rather its function. In the Gothic period, relics were no longer veiled by their reliquaries. Case in point, the remains of St. Clare of Assisi. Her body was displayed publicly until it started to decay. So today, visitors see a wax effigy. This is what you would see if you went there, the beautiful wax St. Clare in repose. But Clare herself is circled in yellow here. She is actually lying behind the wax effigy, and nobody can see her unless the nuns there allow you to go on the other side and take a picture. So here, I don't know if you can see my mouse pointing, but you can see the camera of a tourist on the other side of the case. So that's what the public sees. But this is actually, these are the relics of St. Clare. This is a box of her hair and fingernails, which are also displayed. Another St. Clare, Clare of Montefalco, is displayed. Her full body is displayed. She was a virtuous nun whose heart was literally inscribed with an image of the crucifixion. Upon her death, an autopsy was performed, and the cross, along with tiny instruments of the Passion, were indeed found within her heart. Her body is still displayed in a church in Montefalco, Italy, along with reliquaries displaying her heart, the miraculous images from within it, and 3 gallstones that were taken to symbolize the Trinity. St. Catherine of Siena, most of her body is in Rome, but her head and 1 finger are in Siena, while her foot and 3 more fingers are in Venice. And we're not covering these up. We're letting them shine forth. Another important collector of relics is Louis IX in the Gothic period, and he's the guy who got the crown of thorns in 1238 from the Latin Emperor of Constantinople. So he was so proud of getting the crown of thorns that Louis had the Sainte-Chapelle built, the church that you see on the left there. He had that built as a giant reliquary for the crown of thorns and some parts of the true cross. So the relic stayed there until that church was grievously damaged and its relics were dispersed during the French Revolution. So for a time, the crown of thorns was kept in the National Library of France. And then in 1801, it was finally restored to the church, and they started keeping it at that point at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. But members of the Paris Fire Brigade had to save the relic during the fire at Notre Dame in 2019. So I'm not really positive where it is actually right now, presumably somewhere safe, but it did survive. Just a couple of words about blood relics. Bleeding hosts were an important type of relic in the Gothic period. The Holy Blood of Vilsnack is a case in point. In 1383, the church and village of Bad Vilsnack, Germany, were burnt to the ground. Miraculously, 3 consecrated hosts survived the fire, and from then on, they regularly bled. These bleeding hosts, along with others in Northern Europe, became major pilgrimage destinations for nearly 200 years. Eventually, the bleeding hosts of Vilsnack were destroyed by reformers in 1558 amid the fervor of the Protestant Reformation. So what's there today is just an empty shrine where those hosts used to be. And that's kind of what brought the heyday of relics to an end, was the Protestant Reformation. The largest collection of relics outside the Vatican is at St. Anthony's Chapel in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, of all places. And here's a couple of highlights from the collection. On the right is their proudest possession, which is a single tooth of St. Anthony of Padua, for whom the chapel is named. So if you're like me and you tend to think logically, you see that single tooth and you ask yourself, well, where's the rest of them? That's odd. Well, I can tell you exactly where they are. They're on his jawbone, which I'm hoping you can see here in this outlandishly flamboyant reliquary on the left. That is the jawbone of St. Anthony of Padua, minus one tooth. And we know where that is. And on the right in that same photograph is the tongue reliquary of St. Anthony. And they are regularly paraded and displayed to the public in Padua. So the mouth of St. Anthony was so important because of his skill as a preacher, as a speaker. In 1981, they dug Anthony up for no good reason that I can tell, and found him to be in pretty good shape. And so they took out a piece of his rib and a fragment of his skin, made those golden reliquaries for them, and now they travel the world, where people can come up and touch and kiss them and pray before them. And finally, we do have some local relics that you should check out if you haven't ever. In the Church of St. Martin of Tours, which is downtown on Shelby Street in Louisville, we have the bodies of two early Christian martyrs, Saints Magnus and Venosa. And they are always on full display in these lighted glass cases on either side of the main altar. So make sure and drop in and tell them I said hey. Okay, so sorry about all of the dog drama, but that's it for me. So I'm going to go ahead and throw it to Rick.
Do I have the screen now?
We can see you talking, yes.
Yeah, but okay, there we go. There we go. Put this up with a slideshow from the beginning. There we go.
Got it.
So, well, that doesn't work. Well, anyway, that's the second one. So I've been since the series is on death, I decided to do arguably the most influential poem of the 20th century, The Wasteland, which pictures the death and the dying Western civilization. I'm part of a slim majority that argues that it gives us the hope of rebirth and regeneration. So I volunteered to do this, and then I stopped and I started thinking it's a 440 line poem. It is in 7 languages. When I teach it in a literature class, I take an entire 75 minutes, and the students have read the poem before we had the lecture. And so after fiddling through various iterations of this talk, I realized that I'm never going to analyze and give a real picture of the actual poem. So my hope is that I get enough interest from you that afterwards you go and find the poem and read it. It was published in 1922, so it's out of copyright and you can get it anywhere on the internet. So I'm going to discuss T.S. Eliot, that's Thomas Stearns Eliot's poem, The Wasteland. A bit about Eliot first. He's 1888 to 1965. He's arguably the most influential poet of the 20th century, at least the most influential poet of literary modernism. He was the first American poet to win the Nobel Prize. That was in 1948. And just as a little aside, no American poet has won it since then until Bob Dylan in 2016, and Louise Gluck just won it this year. So we finally had poets from America winning it again some 65 years after Eliot. He was born in St. Louis. His grandfather was a Unitarian minister who was one of the founders of Washington University in St. Louis. So he came from a Gentile, bookish family. He went to Harvard, where he did both undergraduate and graduate work, then went to the Sorbonne in Paris for a year, and then settled in London and spent most of the rest of his life in England, finally becoming a British citizen. He was not too happy with America. So I want to set up the milieu that this poem comes out of, the literary modernism. So throughout the 19th century, we had a lot of changes in the Western world: industrialization, colonialism. And what happened around the end of the last century, 1890s, first couple decades of the 20th century, is that thinkers began to see the problems with industrialization and colonialism. And what I've got here is a picture, a painting or a drawing of London in approximately 1910. The world was run on coal, and it was dirty. I've got on the left some lines from the end of the first section, the beginning of the second section of the Wasteland, and it's in the first two sections. He's describing the decay of modern civilization. And so just to look at the first few lines: unreal city, under the brown fog of a winter dawn, a crowd flowed over London Bridge. So many, I had not thought death had undone so many. Sighs, short and infrequent, were exhaled, and each man fixed his eyes before his feet. So we've got images of the grayish brown smoke of the coal fires, and he's describing dead, and he's not entirely clear whether that's the actual ghosts of World War I, or it's just those men and women that got up at dawn and worked until dark and then trudged home with barely enough money to buy food to eat. But the first 2-3 sections of the poem give us various scenes of that. So in addition to, at the turn of the century, and in addition to the industrialism and colonialism, which we started realizing were not the best things in the world for the rest of the world, thinkers began really seeing changes in how we see the world. I mean, Einstein turned the world around. We had a Copernican, Newtonian universe for several centuries, and then Einstein blows up the space-time continuum, which is pictured in art by, up into the 19th century, most poems, most stories are told in a linear narrative fashion. And what happens in the Wasteland and in modernist poetry and modernist novels is we jump back and forth from mind to mind, from past to present to future. And that is evident of how Einstein discovered the world was. We also had Freud, who his exploration of the unconscious completely upended the way we thought about how human beings think. With, I'm going to name Frazier in anthropology, the budding art of anthropology. Thinkers started realizing that natives and primitives were not brutes. They were just a different culture than Western society. And there was a grand study of how people thought. What I've got here is the first footnote, and it's not a footnote made by somebody else. When Eliot Eliot first published The Wasteland in a book of poetry in a magazine, and then when he published it as a book by itself, 440 lines, his editor said, well, we need a few more pages, so he wrote footnotes. They're actually endnotes, not footnotes. And so he says, not only the title, but the plan and a good deal of the incidental symbolism of the poem were suggested by Miss Jessie Weston and the Grail legend from ritual to romance. Indeed, so deeply am I indebted to Miss Weston's book that Miss Weston's book will elucidate the difficulties of the poem much better than my notes can do, and I recommend it apart from the great interest of the book itself. I also, I'm skipping down a few lines, recommend James Frazier's The Golden Bough, which was a 10-volume study of primitive societies. Essentially, what Miss Weston's book talked about was the Grail legend. And so he says that this book underpins his poem, and she and Frazier essentially say that, hey, this central myth underlies all of human behavior. And it is the idea that when a society is crumbling, some knight goes out and finds a boon that will save the world, and he brings it back to his home community and saves the world. And that's what the Grail legend is. That's what all of King Arthur's knights were doing, going out to look for the Grail legend. If they found the Grail legend, they could bring it back and save England. We still see that story told today. There we go. It's the Grail legend, the one ring that will bind us. So we've got that underpinning the poem, the latest in scientific thinking, and it goes back to the mythologies, the oldest mythologies of humanity, which suggest that there's death and rebirth. Christianity is built on death and rebirth. So this poem, he wrote it in 1920, 1921. It was published in 22. So we had just come out of World War I. This was the final nail in the coffin that suggested to thinkers in the Western world that maybe industrialism was not the greatest thing in the world. I looked some statistics up, and of men ages 18 to 35, 40% of the English men were killed or wounded in the war. 90% of the French men between 18 and 35 were killed or wounded, and 80% of the Germans between 18 and 35 were killed or wounded. I'm not going to go into a lot about World War I, but they essentially had trenches, and then if this looks like a French trench, there's a German trench somewhere about a mile to the right, and they would hop up over this trench and run through barbed wire, being bombarded and machine gunned all the way, and then jump into the other trench if they made it. And they fought back and forth like that for 4 years. What makes this so important is, I'm going to go to the poem now. Here is the beginning of the poem, The Wasteland. So it starts off with a quote from Petronius, the Latin author of the 1st century. Essentially, it says, let's see, nam sibilum quidem cumis ego ipsi oculus meus. The sibilant cumis I saw with my own eyes in ampula pendere, hanging in a cage. Et cum illi pueri discernant. And when the boys asked her, Sibila, Tithele, Sybil, what do you want? Responded about Eli. She responded, Apothene, Thele, I want to die. So the first image in the poem, the Sibyl at Cumus was a prophetess who Apollo gave eternal life, but he did not give eternal youth. So she's an old hag in a hanging in a cage. And so yes, she wants to die. So the first image of the poem is about death. The title of the first section, The Burial of the Dead, that is the title of the section of the English Book of Common Prayer that English priests, Episcopalian priests, read at a funeral. And so it starts off, April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land. Remember the picture I just showed you of the battle scene. So they've been fighting over the same land back and forth for years, and it's nothing but blown up dirt and dead bodies. And this is along the French-Belgian border. And so from December to March, both sides stopped fighting and they just hunkered down into their trenches and they waited for warm weather. So April is the cruelest month because we get the beginning of rebirth, the beginning of spring, lilacs breeding out of the dead land. But it's there's lilacs coming out, which we normally think of spring, oh, spring. But what it signaled for the troops was the beginning of the spring offensives, and they were going to, most of them were going to die. So that's how he starts the poem. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain, memory and desire. He connects past and future together. So into this beginning, we've got, in 1922, he's picturing a world that is sterile, that is dying, that is full of the undead. There's ghosts throughout this poem. There's German dead, there's British dead, there is middle class and upper class English people sitting around drinking their tea and crumpets and talking past each other. There's lower class, working class Englishmen just sitting around bars drinking. They have a sterile, dying life. He pictures it all. The first 200 lines of the poem is just him describing in various iterations how the Western world is dying. And then he gets to the third section. He's halfway through the poem, and all of a sudden he calls, in the first two sections, he's been picturing death, like I say, and then in the third section, he calls it the fire sermon. And in the footnotes, he says, yes, I'm referring to the Buddha's most famous sermon. And that sermon basically discusses how the senses keep us from reality. And as he gets to the end of this third section, he starts moving from the dying to death. The river's tent is broken, the last fingers of leaf clutch and sink into the wet bank. And then he moves to the fourth section, to death by water. Now, again, I can't go into all the details, but he's referring back to a tarot card reading earlier in the poem, in the second section, in the game of chess. But it's a ritual sacrifice, the death before a rebirth. And so here in the fourth section, it's only 14 lines long. We have the death, and then the possibility of rebirth comes in the final section of the poem. And he named that What the Thunder Said. And again, in his end note, he says, I'm referring to a Hindu Upanishad. And what the Upanishad says, going down to the final lines, is if you want to sum up a 20-page sermon, Hindu sermon, it's saying that you should give, and that's in the sense, data, give, that's in the sense that Christ said, hey, give everything away. Dayadavam, sympathize, realize that you and me are all the same person, and then control, or have self-control, control your body in relationship to the universe. So what he does in that wonderful last section is he connects the images in this Hindu Upanishad to images of Christianity, to images of the fertility vegetation myths of Frazier, to show not a rebirth, but at least the possibility of rebirth in this final section of the Wasteland. So it's a hard poem to get through, but if you read it several times, you realize that, hey, maybe it's not the end of the world here in 2020. Maybe we should have some hope. So my hope for you is that you struggle through the poem, that you read it with the end notes, and thank you for listening to me. I don't know how to get rid of it.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Rick. And thank you to Brenda again for both of your talks this evening. Again, this is our last session of our Being Human series. So thank you, of course, to Rick and Brenda and all of our other speakers that we have had during the Being Human series that we presented in partnership with Jefferson Community and Technical College. So just wanted to remind everyone that, of course, we are starting a new series with Brenda Edgar, who spoke with us today. And the series is called Art and Beyond, and that will begin again on Thursday, January 21st at 6:30 p.m. We'll be continuing with our present format of recording and then presenting the recording on Facebook. Hopefully, at some point in 2021, we might be able to do an in-person program. But for safety and health's sake, we will be continuing as we have been. So thank you again to Brenda. Thank you to Rick. And keep an eye out on the library's Facebook page and our events page on our website, floydlibrary.org, for more information on the Art and Beyond series, which will be, again, the third Thursday of the month at 6:30 p.m. on our Facebook page. Thank you so much, and everyone have a wonderful evening.
And thank you, Laura.
Thank you so much, Rick. Thank you, Brenda. All right, take care, and we hope to see you soon.